The wind howled through the towering pines as Daniel cast his fishing line into the glassy river, his breath curling into the crisp morning air, the serenity of the wilderness wrapping around him like an old friend, untouched by time or human interference, a place where he felt more at home than he ever did in the bustling city he had left behind for a weekend of solitude. His only company the distant cry of an eagle overhead and the rhythmic bubbling of the river against the smooth, moss-covered stones at its bank. But as he reeled in his latest catch, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision sent a jolt of unease down his spine, and when he turned, his breath caught in his throat at the sight of the enormous bear standing only yards away, its hulking form partially obscured by the dense foliage, its eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. But instead of charging, instead of baring its fangs or emitting a warning growl as he expected, the bear did something strange, something that sent a shiver down his spine in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. It lifted a paw, not in aggression, but in a slow, deliberate motion, almost as if it were pleading, its dark eyes glistening with something Daniel could only describe as desperation, a silent request rather than a threat, and for a moment he stood frozen, his instincts at war with his logic, because no matter how much he wanted to believe that this was just an ordinary bear seeking food, something about this encounter felt different, felt unnatural, as if he were no longer the one in control of his own story, but merely a spectator in something far bigger. And as the bear took a tentative step closer, its massive body tense yet restrained, Daniel's grip tightened around his fishing pole, his heart hammering against his ribs. Yet despite every survival instinct screaming at him to run, to put distance between himself and the apex predator staring him down, he did something even more unthinkable. He reached into his bucket, pulled out one of the glistening fish he had just caught, and with a deep breath, tossed it toward the bear, half expecting the creature to lunge, to rip it apart in a frenzy of hunger. But instead, the bear lowered its head, sniffed the fish cautiously, then, much to Daniel's disbelief, looked back up at him, its gaze unreadable, as if it were waiting for something, and then as if, confirming his growing suspicion that this was no ordinary animal, it did something even stranger. It turned its head toward the forest, its body still facing him, and let out a low, mournful sound, a guttural noise that sent goosebumps racing across Daniel's skin, because there was no mistaking it. The bear was trying to tell him something, trying to lead him somewhere, and as much as he wanted to dismiss it as a coincidence, as much as he wanted to pack up his things and pretend this wasn't happening, he knew deep down that if he walked away now, if he ignored the silent plea in the animal's eyes, he would regret it for the rest of his life. So with a final glance toward the safety of his fishing spot, he took a tentative step forward, and the bear, as if sensing his decision, turned fully and lumbered into the trees, glancing back only once to make sure he was following. And despite the rational part of his brain screaming that this was a terrible idea, that he was walking straight into a situation he did not understand, curiosity gripped him like an unrelenting force, tightening around his chest like a vice, urging him to follow, and so, with hesitant steps and a heart pounding louder than the whispering wind, Daniel left behind the safety of the riverbank and ventured into the depths of the unknown, trailing behind the mysterious bear that had, against all logic, begged him for help. The bear moved with a steady, deliberate pace, its massive paws making surprisingly little noise against the thick forest floor, and as Daniel trailed behind it, weaving through the dense tangle of trees, a deep sense of unease coiled in his chest, his senses on high alert, the primal part of his brain screaming at him to turn back, to stop playing into whatever strange game this was. But another part of him, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, to the stories hidden just beyond, the veil of the ordinary, kept him moving forward, kept his feet rooted to the path the bear had chosen, and as they ventured deeper into the woods, he noticed something unsettling. The familiar sounds of the wilderness, the distant chirping of birds, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, even the whispering of the wind through the leaves, had all but vanished, replaced by a suffocating stillness that felt unnatural, like stepping into a world untouched by time, a place where, Something far older than himself lurked beneath the surface, waiting, watching, and though he couldn't see it yet, he felt its presence thrumming in the air, thick and electric, setting his nerves on edge in a way that had nothing to do with the bare mere feet ahead of him, and everything to do with the unseen force pulling him forward. And then, just as he was about to question whether he had made a terrible mistake, the trees parted, revealing a clearing so jarring in its stillness that Daniel nearly stumbled at the sight of it, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes locked onto something that should not have been there. At first, his mind refused to comprehend what he was looking at. Half hidden beneath thick vines and layers of moss stood the unmistakable remnants of a structure, an old, forgotten place that had no business existing so deep in the wilderness. It wasn't a simple cabin or a hunting lodge. It was something far older, something that had been left behind by hands that no longer walked this earth. The building, if it could even still be called that, was ancient, its walls crumbling, its wooden beams warped with age and decay. A rusted metal door stood slightly ajar, tilted on broken hinges, its surface marked by deep, jagged scratches that looked eerily like claw marks, though whether they were from the bear beside him or something else entirely, he couldn't tell. The bear let out a low, mournful sound, stepping forward toward the entrance, glancing back at him with an almost expectant look, as if urging him to step inside. And for the first time since he had started following it, true fear settled into his bones, because something about this place felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching against the overgrown debris beneath him, his pulse hammering in his ears as he reached out to touch the weathered frame of the doorway, half expecting it to crumble beneath his fingers. The air around him was thick, heavy, as if the very forest was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide, to turn back or to step into whatever mystery had been buried here, forgotten by time. But Daniel had never been one to turn away from a mystery, no matter how much every instinct screamed at him to leave this place alone. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. Ancient curses, or the kind of folklore that old fishermen whispered about when the nights grew long. But standing here, inside a decaying structure that should not exist, he felt something beneath his skin, crawling like an itch he couldn't scratch. Something was wrong here. The air itself felt thick, heavy with the weight of time and secrets that had been buried for far too long. He swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tighter as he stepped further into the abandoned chamber. The bear moved ahead, its massive form brushing against the walls as it navigated the narrow space with surprising ease. Daniel kept his distance, mindful of the fact that, no matter how oddly human its desperation had seemed, it was still a wild animal, unpredictable and powerful. His eyes flicked over the strange symbols carved into the walls. They weren't random scratches. They had meaning. They flowed in patterns, twisting in ways that made his head ache if he stared for too long. Some were faded, eroded by time, but others were disturbingly clear, as though they had been etched recently. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Who had made these? Better yet, who had lived here? A sudden metallic clang echoed from deeper within the structure. Daniel flinched, heart pounding. The bear, however, didn't react in fear. Instead, it let out a low, deep rumble and kept moving. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to turn back and pretend he had never seen this place. But he couldn't. Not now. The bear had led him here for a reason, and he had to find out why. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Daniel could see his breath in the dim light, the air damp and stale. The hallways were lined with rusted metal pipes, some of them bent or broken, leaking a strange, viscous substance that smelled faintly of iron. He wrinkled his nose, stepping carefully over debris. Then he saw them, cages, lining the walls, stacked atop one another. Most were empty, their doors either broken or hanging open. But the ones that weren't empty, Daniel felt his stomach twist. The remains were barely recognizable. Bones, gnawed down to splinter fragments. Clumps of fur, some stained dark with old blood. The air reeked of decay, despite how old everything looked. Something had lived here. Something had died here. His pulse hammered against his skull as his flashlight swept across the room. This wasn't just some abandoned outpost. This was a facility, a place where things had been kept. And whatever they had been, they weren't just animals. His fingers brushed against a rusted metal panel near the entrance, and to his shock, it moved. The scrape of metal against stone made him wince. But then, a light flickered to life. A dim, orange glow from a single overhead bulb. Daniel's breath hitched. The power still worked, which meant someone or something had been here recently. He turned sharply, shining his flashlight deeper into the chamber. That's when he saw it. At first, Daniel thought it was a mound of decayed fur, another forgotten remnant of whatever had happened here. But as he stepped closer, his stomach lurched. It was a body. Not human, but not quite an animal either. It was roughly the size of a bear, but its proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the ribcage too wide, and its skull, its skull. 2 sets of eye sockets. Daniel swallowed the bile, rising in his throat. Whatever this thing had been, it wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to exist. The bear let out a low, mournful sound, stepping closer to the carcass. Then, with a careful nudge of its massive paw, it revealed something hidden beneath. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was a cub, tiny, frail, barely breathing. A wave of understanding crashed over him. The bear had led him here because it wasn't just begging for food. It was begging for help. Daniel felt his chest tighten. His first instinct was to step forward, to check on the cub, but a sound stopped him cold. A deep, unnatural clicking. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The sound came from the far end of the chamber, where a gaping hole led into darkness. Something moved in that darkness. And then, a figure stepped into the light. Daniel's breath hitched. The thing that emerged was tall. Too tall. Its limbs were thin, its joints bent the wrong way, and its 4 empty eye sockets stared straight at him. His body locked up. He wanted to run, needed to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The creature tilted its head. Then, with a sickening crack, it took a step forward. The bear let out a warning roar, stepping between Daniel and the creature, but even Daniel knew this wasn't a fight they could win. This thing, whatever it wasn't an experiment gone wrong. It was still alive, and it was hungry. Daniel's pulse exploded. Move, move, move. His fingers closed around a rusted pipe, yanking it free from the debris. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding like a drumbeat in his ears. The creature lunged. The bear charged. And the fight for survival began. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. Roars, shrieks, the clang of metal against flesh. Daniel barely remembered swinging the pipe, barely felt it connect with something solid. The bear was a fury of movement, claws tearing into the creature as it let out an inhuman screech. Daniel's only thought was escape. The cub, the mother, they had to get out. With one last desperate strike, Daniel turned and ran. The bear followed. The cub clutched carefully in its massive jaws. Behind them, the creature screeched in rage, but Daniel didn't stop, didn't look back. He just ran. The next morning, Daniel stood at the edge of the forest, his body aching, his mind reeling from everything he had just survived. The bear sat a few yards away, the cub nestled safely beside her. For a moment, their eyes met, and then, just like that, she turned, disappearing into the trees. Daniel let out a shaky breath. The world would never believe what he had seen. But some things weren't meant to be understood. Some things were meant to be left alone. And whatever lurked in those ruins, he prayed it would never find its way out.